They called him the boy in the box. No name, no identity. Just a small, broken body found alone in the woods outside Philadelphia. Wrapped in a tattered blanket, placed inside a cardboard box meant for a bassinet. It was February 25th, 1957. The air was cold enough to sting your lungs. And on a lonely roadside near Susquehanna Road, a college student stumbled upon something he would never forget. At first, he thought it was a doll. Then, he saw the bruises, the cuts, the unmistakable shape of a human child. That moment, that single discovery would ignite one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. A case that would torment detectives for decades. And even now, more than half a century later, it still whispers the same question. Who was he? And who could have done this to him? To understand, we have to go back to that cold winter afternoon, to the man who first found the box. He was a 26-year-old college student named Frederick Bononis, out checking his muskrat traps along a quiet stretch of Fox Chase Woods. When he saw the box, he almost kept walking. It was common for people to dump trash there. But something about the way the blanket was tucked, neatly, carefully, made him stop. He pried the lid open and froze. Inside lay the body of a young boy, maybe 3 or 4 years old. His face, pale and bruised, seemed almost peaceful. His eyes closed as if he were sleeping. The box was labeled J.C. Penney Bassinet. There were no toys, no clothing, no signs of who he was. Just the child and the blanket. Bononis ran to the nearest phone and called the police. Within the hour, the quiet woods of Fox Chase were crawling with officers. Detective Stanley Zaleski of the Philadelphia Police Department arrived first. He was a veteran cop, the kind who'd seen everything, or thought he had. But this was different. The body was clean, recently bathed. His hair had been freshly cut, unevenly, as if someone had done it in a hurry. There were bruises all over his legs and arms, and on his face, the faint outline of old scars. The box itself told its own story. It had once contained a bassinet shipped from a local J.C. Penney store. Police traced the serial number and found it had been sold in Upper Darby, but to their frustration, it was one of 12 identical boxes. No records, no receipts, no clear lead. The boy's small body was taken to the city morgue. The coroner's report was grim. Malnutrition, head trauma, and multiple bruises, some old, some fresh. He'd been dead only a few days. But something about him was tender. Even in death, he looked cared for, cleaned, combed. It was as if his killer wanted him to look peaceful, almost loved, before being discarded. The box was somewhere else. Detectives gave him a name of sorts, America's Unknown Child. Posters went out across Philadelphia, flyers, newspaper spreads. Every morgue photo, every sketch, printed in hopes that someone, anyone, would recognize him. No one did. Weeks passed, then months. Hundreds of leads poured in, but each one ended in a dead end. No missing child reports matched his description. No families came forward to claim him. It was as if this little boy had never existed at all. But investigators refused to give up. They scoured orphanages, hospitals, foster homes. They checked every nearby house that had purchased a bassinet. Still, nothing. The public began to whisper theories. Some said he was the child of traveling carnival workers, left behind when the show moved on. Others swore he was a kidnapped boy from another state. And darker rumors began to circulate. Stories of underground adoption rings, of children sold and discarded. Through it all, one image burned itself into the memory of everyone who saw it. The boy's face, soft, innocent, and bruised. His small hands folded across his chest, and the cardboard box that had become his coffin. Years later, one detective would say, "That boy became our city's ghost. He never left us." And yet, even ghosts leave traces, clues, shadows, something that refuses to stay buried. And in the boy in the box case, that something was about to surface. The boy's autopsy revealed details that made seasoned detectives go silent. His nails were neatly trimmed. His skin, though bruised, had been scrubbed. His stomach was empty. No food, no water for at least a day before death. And yet, there was soap residue behind his ears. Someone had washed him. Someone had cared enough to clean him before placing him in that box. Detective Zaleski ordered the boy's fingerprints to be taken. It was a long shot, but perhaps they'd find a match in missing child databases or hospital records. They didn't. Not a single record matched. Police began canvassing the neighborhood around Fox Chase. House to house, yard to yard, they searched for any sign of a missing child. But people in the area claimed they'd never seen him before. No one recognized his face, his haircut, or the blanket he was wrapped in. Then came a small clue. The blanket, a cheap cotton kind, was stitched in a unique pattern, possibly handmade. Detectives took it door to door, showing it to residents and tailors alike. No match. But it told them something. Whoever this boy was, he hadn't come from wealth. Soon, the press caught wind of the story. The Inquirer ran a headline, "Body of Boy Found in Cardboard Box. Mystery Deepens." The city was captivated and horrified. Within days, thousands of flyers were printed, showing his face under the title, "Unidentified Boy." Detective James Kelly, one of the younger investigators on the case, later said, "We thought the mother would see the photo and come running. We waited by the phone for days." But the phone stayed silent. Weeks turned to months, and still no mother, no father, no one claiming the child. A small, quiet funeral was arranged by the detectives themselves. The boy was buried in a potter's field, with a simple marker that read, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy." But even then, the case refused to rest. Detectives were haunted, not by guilt, but by curiosity. Something about this story felt incomplete. A new lead arrived from Upper Darby. A woman claimed she had seen a child who looked like the boy months before, in a neighborhood just outside Philadelphia. She described a mother who seemed secretive, possibly abusive, keeping her children hidden from neighbors. Police investigated, but found no evidence. The woman had since moved away. Another dead end. By now, the investigation had stretched across 3 states. They checked every hospital, adoption agency, and orphanage. But the same answer echoed back every time. No record of a missing boy that matched. Still, hope lingered. Forensic experts re-examined the boy's body. They found strange marks on his ankle, perhaps from a brace or medical treatment, and scars on his chin, groin, and left leg. Each mark seemed to tell a story of pain, of healing, of someone who had lived unseen. The community began to call him Little Boy Lost. Anonymous citizens brought flowers to his grave. Children whispered his story on playgrounds. He became a legend, a ghostly reminder that somewhere, someone had gotten away with murder. Then, nearly a year later, the case took a strange turn. Detective Zaleski received an anonymous phone call. The voice on the line was trembling, female, possibly young. She said she knew who the boy was. But before Zaleski could ask questions, the line went dead. The number was untraceable, and no one ever called back. Still, it ignited something. Detectives began reanalyzing every shred of evidence. The box, the blanket, the haircut. And one investigator noticed something new. A peculiar crosshatch mark on the back of the boy's neck, almost surgical in nature. It suggested medical treatment or restraint, which meant somewhere, someone had cared for him before he died. But who would go to such lengths to keep a child clean and then leave him in the cold? That question, that haunting paradox, would soon unravel the investigation entirely, because the next tip that came in would lead detectives not to a stranger, but to a woman with a story so unbelievable it would divide the entire Philadelphia police force. Frank Bender stood over the small white coffin. He wasn't a detective or a cop, just an artist who saw stories in silence. Before him lay the exhumed remains of the boy, so fragile they looked like porcelain. Most men would have looked away. Bender leaned closer. He wasn't here to mourn. He was here to listen. Frank Bender had worked with police before, sketching the faces of fugitives and reconstructing skulls to identify unknown victims. But this one was different. This was the case everyone whispered about. The nameless child who'd haunted Philadelphia since 1957. He studied the skull under the cold fluorescent light. Gently, with a sculptor's hands, he began to rebuild what time had taken. Clay over bone. A nose, lips, cheekbones. Every stroke of his tool was a question. Who were you, little one? Who did this to you? Hours became days. Days, weeks. Until finally, a face emerged. Not just a skull anymore, but a boy again. Soft features, sad eyes. Innocence frozen in plaster. When Bender unveiled the bust, detectives fell silent. One whispered, "That's him." The sculpture was photographed and sent across the country. Frank's creation appeared on TV, in newspapers, and in post offices. Every line of that small face carried a plea. Someone, somewhere, must remember me. And soon, people did. Calls poured in. From New Jersey, New York, even Florida. A woman swore she'd babysat that very boy. Another insisted he'd lived next door to her cousin. Each lead felt promising. Each one fell apart. But Bender didn't stop. He joined a small team of volunteers, investigators, journalists, and retired cops who called themselves the Vidocq Society. Named after a legendary French detective, they specialized in unsolved murders. Their mission was simple: give the forgotten a name. And so, the boy in the box became their obsession. Over the years, Frank and his team re-examined every scrap of evidence. The blanket, handmade. The box, traced to a local J.C. Penney store. The child's hair, cut recently but unevenly, suggesting it was done in haste. It all pointed to one thing: the killer had cared enough to clean him, but not enough to save him. That contradiction tore at Frank. He believed this wasn't the work of a stranger. It was something more, intimate,
something domestic. The child hadn't been dumped like garbage. He'd been laid out, wrapped, almost tucked in. Frank began to imagine the boy's final moments, not as a crime scene, but a tragedy inside a home. A home filled with fear, control, and silence. That's when he stumbled on a new theory. He believed the boy might have been the illegitimate child of a young woman, hidden from the world to protect a family's reputation. Perhaps he'd lived his short life behind closed doors, seen by no one but those who wished he didn't exist. And when he died, whether by accident or abuse, his tiny body became a secret that had to be erased. The theory gained traction. Reporters printed headlines. Detectives reopened the files again. DNA testing was still primitive, but whispers of progress grew louder. Someone, somewhere, had to share the blood. Frank Bender, the artist, grew older, but the boy never aged. His reconstructed face sat in Frank's studio, watching him day after day. Friends said he'd talk to it sometimes, not out loud, but with the eyes of a man haunted by a promise. "I'll find your name," he'd murmur. "I swear it." Years passed. Technology advanced. DNA profiles, databases, and genealogy sites began to change everything. Forensic science could now do what art and instinct never could: trace a name through blood. And yet, the boy still waited. Until one winter morning in 2022, a call came through that would end a mystery 65 years in the making. For the first time, the boy in the box would have a name, but with it would come a revelation darker than anyone expected.
The room was silent, except for the hum of the lab equipment. Detective Bill Kelly stared at the screen, watching as digital data translated decades of mystery into one undeniable truth. It wasn't just numbers. It was an identity. A life once forgotten, now whispering back through strands of DNA. After 65 years of silence, the boy in the box finally had a name: Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Born in January of 1953, a little boy from West Philadelphia, loved, perhaps, at least once, but somewhere, something went terribly wrong. The DNA evidence extracted from hair found inside the box was matched through advanced genealogical tracing. It led to distant relatives, then closer ones, until finally to parents who long passed away. Both were identified. Neither had ever reported their son missing. That, more than anything, chilled the investigators, because it meant that for 65 years, someone, maybe even many, had known, and they'd chosen silence. The discovery made headlines around the world. Boy in the box finally identified after 65 years. But for detectives like Kelly, the celebration was brief. A name was a beginning, not an ending. Now came the hardest question of all: what really happened to Joseph? The new leads reopened a flood of theories. Some believed his death was an accident, a tragic consequence of neglect or abuse that spiraled out of control. Others suspected deliberate harm. But one detail stood out in every report: the care with which his body had been placed in the box. Wrapped in a blanket, hair freshly cut, hands gently folded. It was almost ritualistic, like someone couldn't bring themselves to throw him away, someone who cared and yet destroyed him. Detectives turned back to the family tree. They found half-siblings still alive. They hadn't even known Joseph existed. His name had been erased from the family story, his memory deliberately buried. A secret too heavy to tell. But secrets have gravity, and in time, they surface. Through careful analysis of old case files, investigators began piecing together the household's dark dynamics. A broken marriage, unstable relationships, and a pattern of violence that had quietly threaded through generations. Joseph had likely been born into chaos, and when that chaos took his life, the adults around him didn't seek help. They sought silence. Still, even with his identity known, no one alive today could be charged. There was no living witness, no confession, just fragments of evidence scattered across time, a blanket, a box, a nameless tomb. Detective Kelly stood over Joseph's grave the day they replaced the old marker. It no longer read America's Unknown Child. It now bore a name, Joseph Augustus Zarelli, a name carved in stone, finally returned to him. The case officially remains unsolved, but for the people who'd spent their lives searching, Frank Bender, the Vidocq Society, and the detectives who came after, the name was enough. It meant that Joseph had never been forgotten. It meant that even in death, truth found a way. As Detective Kelly turned to leave the cemetery, he whispered something, words only the wind could hear. "Rest now, little one. The world finally knows who you are." But as with all stories like this, one haunting question still lingers. Who silenced Joseph? And how many others are still waiting to be found? It's strange how a single name, whispered decades too late, can ripple across generations. Joseph Augustus Zarelli. For 65 years, he was simply the boy in the box. A mystery, a case number, a haunting photograph on a cold city bulletin board. But the moment that name surfaced, something shifted in Philadelphia. Because when you name the forgotten, you bring them back into the world. Detective Kelly once said, "We didn't just solve part of a case. We gave a child his humanity back." That's the echo Joseph left behind, a quiet revolution in empathy. His story became more than a crime. It became a mirror, a reflection of what happens when a society looks away from its most vulnerable. Across the nation, the revelation reignited conversations about the unseen, the neglected, the abused, the discarded. True crime enthusiasts, historians, even ordinary citizens who'd followed the case for decades, all felt something raw resurface. People began leaving flowers at his grave again. Letters, too. Notes written by strangers who'd grown up haunted by his photograph. That frail, fragile face framed by an old wooden box. Some called him our boy. Others simply wrote, "I'm sorry." But Joseph's impact wasn't just emotional. It was forensic. His case became a benchmark for modern genealogy-based investigation. The same technology that unmasked the Golden State Killer was refined and sharpened through cases like his. In fact, the Philadelphia Police Department now trains investigators nationwide using the lessons learned from Joseph's identification.
It changed how cold cases are viewed, not as lost causes, but as waiting stories, silent puzzles, just needing the right hands and the right tools to speak again.
It began as a local headline. A nameless boy, a wooden box, and a city that couldn't look away. But over time, the story of the boy in the box transformed into something far bigger. A reflection of America's obsession with mystery and its uneasy relationship with truth. By the early 1960s, the case had already become part of Philadelphia's urban mythology. Neighborhood kids whispered about the ghost boy in the woods. Parents warned their children not to wander too far, invoking his story as both a cautionary tale and a haunting bedtime warning. He's still out there, waiting to be found. But it wasn't just folklore. The case captured the attention of national media, Life magazine, The Inquirer, even America's Most Wanted decades later. Joseph's photograph, the one showing him bruised but strangely peaceful, became one of the most reproduced crime images in U.S. history. It was unsettling, yet people couldn't stop looking. There was something sacred in the sadness of that small, still face. Television amplified the mystery. In the 1980s and 90s, with the rise of true crime journalism, Joseph's story resurfaced again and again. Talk shows debated his origins. Documentaries speculated wildly. Some called him a foster child, others a victim of trafficking, even a runaway. The theories multiplied faster than the facts. It was tragedy repackaged as entertainment. And yet, every retelling brought new attention, new hope that someone, somewhere, might finally recognize him. Then came the internet. Online forums like web sleuths and Reddit reignited the investigation in the digital age. Amateur detectives pored over crime scene photos, autopsy notes, newspaper clippings. They traced vintage baby blankets, compared fingerprints, even debated the box's manufacturer. It became a community effort, a digital vigil. Thousands of users united by one goal: to give a name to the unknown. And they did something extraordinary. They kept him alive. Every post, every theory, every night spent searching through archives was an act of collective memory. It was proof that even a forgotten child could echo louder than time itself. But that attention came with a darker edge. Some turned Joseph's tragedy into spectacle, using his image for clickbait, his suffering for views. Ethicists began questioning the fine line between remembrance and exploitation. Had true crime storytelling become too desensitized, too performative? Was empathy being replaced by curiosity? Psychologists studying media trends noticed a pattern. The more the case was covered, the more detached the audience became. Each re-upload of his photograph dulled its impact just a little bit more. Familiarity turned horror into habit. The boy's story, once a plea for justice, risked becoming just another headline in an endless feed of tragedies. But then, DNA changed everything. When police announced in 2022 that they had finally identified him, the internet paused. For a moment, all the noise stopped. Comment sections filled with quiet awe. The same people who'd spent years speculating now felt something profoundly human:
closure, and grief, because behind every mystery was a real person, and behind every theory, a real loss. The case's resurgence forced journalists to confront their own ethics. Major outlets rewrote their coverage, refocusing on the victim's humanity rather than the horror. Reporters stopped saying the boy and started saying Joseph. Even YouTube creators, some of whom had built entire channels around unsolved cases, began adding memorial statements and resource links for missing children at the end of their videos. Joseph's story reshaped the conversation about true crime media. It taught millions of viewers that curiosity must come with compassion, that mystery can't exist without memory, and that the purpose of storytelling isn't just to reveal what happened, but to remember who it happened to. Today, in a quiet cemetery in Philadelphia, people still visit his grave. They leave notes, flowers, and occasionally a small wooden toy. Not because they want answers, but because they already found what mattered most. The boy in the box finally had a name, and a world that had once forgotten him finally remembered.
Science. It has a way of speaking for the voiceless, and in the case of the boy in the box, it became his only language. For decades, his tiny frame lay preserved in the cold vault of memory, a child with no name, no records, no voice. But then came a revolution, one born not from guesswork or rumor, but from the double helix of truth itself: DNA. In 1998, long before DNA testing became routine, investigators from Philadelphia quietly exhumed the child's remains. They hoped, perhaps too optimistically, that science might finally do what decades of detective work could not. But technology back then was crude by modern standards. They extracted mitochondrial DNA from a strand of his hair, hoping to trace his maternal line. Unfortunately, there were no matches in any database. And so, the boy returned to the earth, nameless once more. But science doesn't forget. By the 2010s, genetic genealogy had emerged as a new frontier in crime solving. The same technique that would later unmask the Golden State Killer now offered a faint glimmer of hope for Joseph. In 2019, investigators exhumed him again. This time, they took DNA samples using advanced extraction methods, pulling usable material from his teeth and femur. It was delicate, painstaking work. And when those samples entered the national genealogy databases, they began to whisper. Those whispers turned into connections, faint threads stretching across states, families, and generations. A second cousin here, a distant relative there. Each fragment of genetic data was like a syllable in a language that science was slowly learning to speak. Bit by bit, the algorithm began to build a map, one that led investigators to a family tree in rural Pennsylvania. And then to a woman who had given birth to a boy in the mid-1950s, a boy who vanished from all public record. Her name was Martha. Martha's story is one tangled in silence and pain. She lived a troubled life, marked by instability, poverty, and fractured family ties. Her son, Joseph, was never officially reported missing. Neighbors recalled seeing a quiet, withdrawn child, but one day he was simply gone. And nobody, not even those closest to her, asked too many questions. It wasn't until investigators reached out to surviving relatives that the truth began to take shape. They provided DNA samples. One by one, those results aligned until the pattern was undeniable.
In late 2022, police held a press conference and said what the city had waited 65 years to hear. The boy in the box has a name. His name is Joseph Augustus Zarelli. The announcement sent shockwaves across the country. News outlets broke the story simultaneously. Social media flooded with memorial posts, prayers, and disbelief. People who had followed the case their entire lives wept openly. Joseph was no longer a ghost. He was real. A child with a name, a home, a mother, and, finally, an identity. The forensic team behind the breakthrough became instant heroes in the investigative community. For them, Joseph's identification wasn't just a victory, it was validation, a testament to decades of persistence, evolving science, and the simple human refusal to forget. But the discovery also raised new questions. If Joseph was identified, what about justice? Who was responsible for his death? Was it his mother? Someone else? And if those answers were buried long ago, did DNA still have the power to dig them up? Investigators tried to trace his father, Augustus, but both parents had long since passed away. Neither would ever face questioning, trial, or consequence. All that remained were family whispers, inconsistencies, and memories warped by time. Some detectives admitted privately that the truth might never be fully known. But in a sense, it didn't need to be. Because solving a murder isn't always about handcuffs and convictions. Sometimes it's about remembrance, about restoring dignity to the forgotten. And Joseph's name did exactly that. His case reignited global interest in using forensic genealogy for the unidentified dead. Hundreds of cold cases across the U.S. reopened in the wake of his identification. In Arizona, California, and New York, nameless victims once reduced to case numbers were being rediscovered, one DNA strand at a time. Whispering, science was becoming a form of resurrection. But while the world celebrated, detectives in Philadelphia sat with a different emotion: unease. Because even with the name revealed, one haunting question remained. Why did it happen? Who hurt Joseph? And how could a child simply disappear without one person demanding answers for 65 years? Those questions would define the final stage of the investigation, not in laboratories or press rooms, but in the quiet space between justice and acceptance. Because sometimes knowing the name isn't the end, it's only the beginning. In the next chapter, we step into that uneasy space, where fact meets speculation and silence hides behind every answer, where we confront not just what happened to Joseph Augustus Zarelli, but why.
The truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it hides behind whispers, contradictions, and the things no one dares to remember. By the time investigators had given Joseph Augustus Zarelli his name, most of the people who might have known the full story were already gone. But silence, as they soon discovered, could still speak. Detectives began tracing surviving family members, distant relatives, cousins once removed, neighbors who had lived near Martha Zarelli in the 1950s. They listened to stories, disconnected fragments. A mother who struggled with her mental health. A child who was rarely seen outside. A man, maybe a boyfriend, maybe more, who came and went without explanation. There were whispers of violence in the home, of a child crying through thin walls. But in that era, domestic troubles were private matters, things neighbors pretended not to hear. When investigators compared timelines, they found inconsistencies. Martha had told some people her son had been placed in an institution.
Others recalled her saying he was being cared for by relatives. But no records of such arrangements existed. No adoption papers, no institutional files, just absence. What made the case even more haunting was how close the pieces had always been. The Zarelli family lived in Philadelphia, barely a few miles from where the boy's body was found. He had been lying in a box, wrapped in a blanket, within driving distance of his own bloodline. For decades, they passed that stretch of road without knowing their lost child rested there. Some detectives began to believe Joseph's death wasn't a random act of cruelty. It might have been accidental, a punishment gone too far, a moment of panic followed by a cover-up. Others suspected deliberate violence. The bruises on his body told a story of repeated trauma, not a single moment, but many. And the way he was left, with care, wrapped, posed, hinted at guilt, or love twisted beyond recognition. What does remorse look like when it's already too late? Psychologists brought in to consult on the case described a likely pattern of abuse escalating over time. Children in such households often disappear emotionally long before they vanish physically. Neighbors might see them less and less. They stop playing outside. Their names fade from conversations. Until one day, no one asks where they've gone. And in the 1950s, before child welfare systems, before mandated reporting, there were no safety nets. If a child disappeared, it wasn't always noticed, especially one born into poverty. But for modern investigators, the emotional weight of this case went beyond the forensics. They'd spent decades staring at the photo of a little boy in a cardboard box, his eyes half closed, his expression hauntingly peaceful. They'd nicknamed him America's Unknown Child. And that photo had followed them through generations of detectives, hanging on bulletin boards, living in their dreams. When his identity was confirmed, many of those same officers, retired now, came forward. Some cried on camera. Others simply nodded, their faces still and heavy with the burden of closure that came too late. One said, "We solved his name, but not his story." Another whispered, "He waited too long for justice." The public, too, became divided in their search for meaning. Was Joseph's death a tragedy born of circumstance or a deliberate act of evil? The forums filled with speculation. Some blamed the mother. Some pointed toward unnamed men in her life. Others believed the truth died with them both. But amidst all the theories, one fact stood firm. For the first time in history, an unidentified child was given his name back through science alone. That victory, though small in the grand scale of justice, carried enormous symbolic weight. Because every nameless victim represents a question mark, a story left unfinished. And Joseph's case reminded the world that even decades later, answers can still rise from the dirt and the dark. Still, detectives knew something deeper lingered beneath the surface. If Joseph's name could be found, what about the why? What drives someone to harm a child, their own child? What kind of isolation, pain, or desperation could create that kind of cruelty? Those weren't just questions for the case. They were questions for all of us. Because the boy in the box wasn't just a tragedy frozen in time. He was a mirror, showing how easily the smallest lives can vanish when society looks away. And so, while Philadelphia mourned, the world began to reflect, not just on the mystery that had haunted generations, but on the silence that allowed it to happen. In our next and final chapter, we explore that silence and the legacy it left behind. How the story of one unidentified boy reshaped forensic history, inspired thousands, and forced the world to confront a single eternal question. What does remember look like?
For 65 years, the story of the boy in the box drifted like smoke, impossible to grasp, impossible to forget. And yet, through all those years, he never stopped speaking, not with words, but through the people who refused to let him vanish. After the 2022 DNA breakthrough, the Philadelphia Police Department held a press conference. A single photograph sat before them, a black and white portrait of a little boy whose face had become an icon of mystery. For the first time, beneath that photograph, a name was printed: Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Detective Jason Smith stood before the cameras, his voice steady but cracked by emotion. He said, "This child was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's entire world. And now he has his name back." It wasn't just a statement. It was a promise that forgotten souls don't stay forgotten forever. Joseph's surviving relatives were notified privately. They did not speak publicly. Their grief, silent, decades removed, was theirs alone. And perhaps that was fitting, because in a case where silence had once been the weapon, now it became the shield. Investigators made one more quiet journey, back to Ivy Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, where Joseph had been buried under a small stone marked America's Unknown Child. That day, the words changed. A new stone was placed, engraved with his full name and the years of his short life. Flowers appeared, candles flickered, and strangers gathered. People who had never met him, yet somehow felt they knew him. Grief, after all, doesn't need to be personal to be real. Reporters covering the story began to reflect on what it meant for society. How many other children, lost, abused, neglected, had slipped through the cracks, their stories erased by time and shame? Joseph became a symbol, not just of mystery, but of persistence. The idea that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of resurfacing. Cold case units across the country drew inspiration from Philadelphia's success. Forensic genealogy, once experimental, became the new gold standard. Cases from the 1970s, 1980s, even earlier, began reopening. Nameless victims were finally being identified. And every name restored was a victory, a small defiance against the oblivion of history. But in the quiet corners of that victory, darker questions remained. Why did it take so long? Why did no one step forward when that boy's face was printed on every newspaper in 1957? Why did entire communities turn away from the sound of suffering behind closed doors? Maybe the truth isn't only in who hurt him. Maybe it's in who didn't help him. The neighbors who heard, the teachers who noticed the bruises, the relatives who wondered but never asked. In the years since Joseph's name was restored, psychologists and criminologists have revisited the case, not to assign new blame, but to learn from it. They talk about bystander apathy, about how people rationalize what they see, convincing themselves that someone else will act. And in that silence, tragedies grow. If Joseph had been born today, things might have been different. With child protection systems, digital records, DNA testing, and social awareness, his absence wouldn't have gone unnoticed. But in the 1950s, privacy and shame were the walls that held everything in. So his story, while tragic, also became a warning
a reminder of the cost of indifference. And yet, amidst that darkness, there's a light. Because people did care. They cared enough to remember him, to investigate him, to name him. Even when the world moved on, detectives, volunteers, and citizens kept fighting for him. Joseph's case inspired podcasts, documentaries, classroom discussions, each one keeping his memory alive. Children who saw his picture in the news asked their parents, who was he? And through that simple question, the story kept breathing. Now his name rests beneath a new headstone, no longer unknown. And maybe, somewhere beyond the reach of time, that small boy finally rests too. Because remembering is a kind of justice. So tonight, as you turn off the lights and lock your door, think about this. How many stories remain, waiting beneath the surface of silence? How many forgotten names still linger in unmarked graves, hoping to be spoken again? I'll leave you with that question. This is Mythos and Murder Manor. Thank you for joining me tonight. If you have theories, thoughts, or other cases you'd like me to investigate, share them in the comments. And remember, monsters don't live under your bed. Sometimes they live right next door.